As Christians, our focus is on pleasing God, not man. Yet, there are few things that please God more than to see His kingdom expand and lives being touched. That being the case, it's very important to be aware of how we are perceived by the community. Are we considered a force for good, maybe an irrelevancy, or worse still, are we thought of as a problem? In terms of community perception, Laurel has tended to fare quite well. What you're about to hear is an excerpt from an article written by Ray D. Webb that was first published in the Monday edition of the Knoxville Journal sometime in 1936.
Arriving at the Laurel Avenue Church of Christ yesterday, the writer was greeted by Reverend J. Paul Sladen, minister, his son Paul Jr., William O. Gwynn, attorney and former newspaper writer, Mrs. Oliver Hill, Mrs. Fanny Wright, Mr. and Mrs. Mac Tucker, Joel H. Anderson, Professor Leonard Kirk, Paul Morgan, Mrs. Betty Hill, and others. Accompanied by Mr. O'Gwen, a visit to each class was inspiring and interesting. Many of the class members seldom miss a Sunday school or church service. With the exception of one Sunday, when she was in Mexico, Mrs. Oliver W. Hill, charter member of the church and active in all phases of the church work, has missed very few times in 25 years, and before coming to Knoxville, attended church elsewhere. The Reverend Mr. Sladen explained that the Church of Christ stands for what is taught in the New Testament, pointing out that members of many other denominations probably at heart were believers in the same doctrine, but were not informed. Sunday, the day set aside in honor of all mothers, found scores of mothers at the Sunday school and church services. Oldest mothers present were Mrs. Fanny Wright, 70, Mrs. Arch Cupp, Mrs. Walter Scott, and Mrs. Lena Gardner of Rosedale, Mississippi, mother of Mrs. Oliver Hill. Mrs. Gardner is 71. The youngest mother present was Mrs. Jack Keyes, 17. Mrs. Keyes has an infant daughter, Nancy. Laurel Avenue Church has an aggressive, fast-growing Sunday school with able teachers. There are 7 classes with a total membership of about 130 and an average attendance of 80. The church used to be located on Broadway. 8 years ago, the church was moved to its present location when the home of another church was purchased along with the lots adjoining, where the congregation hopes to soon erect a large church built to house the fast-growing congregation.
What matters to God is that we're faithful, regardless of what the world may think of us. When our faithfulness leads the world to hold us in high regard, one cannot help but to think that God is pleased. See you next week.